do the screen sharing thing first off. Okay. All right, can everybody thumbs up if you can see the screen? Okay, perfect. Thank you for the introduction, Ollie. I'm going to try not to make this a serious talk by any stretch, because although it was a long journey, I'm going to talk about it wasn't really a serious journey. It wasn't something that anyone had ever done before, but it was probably because no one ever wanted to do it before. It was essentially a way of avoiding work for a year and a half and living the life that I most wanted to live. It was a longish walk across Europe. And I'm not a very good public speaker. I grew up with a stammer, which until my early 20s made any kind of public speaking an absolute torment. I remember being at school wanting the ground to swallow me up because I just couldn't speak without stammering, and I could never marshal my thoughts. So if when I'm talking, I go off at a strange tangent, please bear with me and forgive me. And I also found in the shows I've done about this journey, it's practically impossible to talk about it for just an hour, to sum it up in a short length of time. Because 18 months, the length the journey lasted, is a long time. And 1 hour is a tiny fraction of that. It's like trying to sum up a 3-hour mountain run in 0.82 of a second. So imagine all the things you go through on a long mountain run, all of the ups and downs, literally and spiritually, all the nuances that you encounter, and you only have 0.82 seconds to describe it, which basically gives you time to say, "We're for a run." So this show may be a little like that. I'll try and give you a hint of what it was, but I think that's the best I can do. So this is what the walk was. I started down at the tip of the Italian boot, down in Calabria, walked all the way through the Apennine mountains, did some strange slaloming through the Alps, up through the Bohemian forests and the mountains of central Germany, across the North German plain, up the Danish coast, and then spent 6 months walking the length of Norway and a little bit of Sweden. It was roughly 7,000 miles. At the time, I was measuring it with a bootlace held over a map while I was doing the hike. So I don't think my measuring was very accurate. When I finished, I thought I'd done about 6,600 miles. When I later more recently remeasured a couple of bits on a Google map, I realized I was underestimating how far I walked. So it was probably just over 7,000 miles. But the data, the distance, the length of time wasn't the point. Getting to the end wasn't the point. The whole point was just to be there, doing it and experiencing it. So this was the start. Me on the beach in Calabria with probably the smallest pack you've ever seen, I'm hoping. I wasn't, to be honest, as demonstrated here, the world's best lightweight backpacker. I think at its heaviest, my pack, which I nicknamed 10 ton, during a 2-week stretch up in northern Sweden, was about 90 pounds, which is plainly ridiculous for someone who only weighs 140 pounds to carry. My approach was I could carry it, so it was no big deal. It didn't get in the way of the journey. Didn't stop me from connecting with the landscapes I was passing through. And I like being comfortable in camp. I like having a change of clothes. I like having fresh food, not dehydrated stuff. I like having books to read. You know, there was no iPad back then, so I couldn't put 2,000 books into one small package. At one point in the Alps, I think I had 10 books on my back because I wanted to reread them. So some of the things I did weren't necessarily traditional or very smart, I think would be the way of putting it. So yeah, I organized this. I did this walk before the internet. In '97, when I started, it was a fledgling thing compared to the information powerhouse it is now. And so all I did in planning was I got hold of some large-scale maps of Europe, planned a route across the highest places as far from civilization as I could, and kind of roughly estimated where I'd be. The route was never going to be a line indelibly fixed that I had to stick to. It was always just a rough guide, and the whole point was freedom to deviate wherever I wanted to go. I would, you know, change the direction on the spur of the moment, on the toss of a coin, literally. So the challenge I had when starting was paying for it, because I've never been very good at earning money. I worked as a graphic designer, but I wasn't in a big job. And I spent a long time trying to find a corporate sponsor to pay for the hike, which I failed to do. And I postponed the journey. I was originally going to go in 1996, but I postponed it because I couldn't afford it. When 1997 came around, I still only had enough money to pay for the first 6 months of it, and finally made that bold decision, that leap of faith to start this thing, because I knew I didn't start it, I would never start it. So it was quite something, beginning a journey of 18 months, knowing I could only afford to pay for six months of it. And it added a certain tension, a certain doubt throughout the whole journey as to how I would get on, whether I'd have to stop before winter even hit. The other thing, I managed to get a few sponsors. Low Alpine gave me a bunch of gear. Fujifilm donated 250 rolls of slide film for me to use, which were put into parcels and mailed out to different locations along the route. The thing I most struggled with was maps, which was a key part of a journey, especially in Italy. A map store in London that no longer exists promised to donate all the maps for the whole journey, I relied on them fulfilling that promise, but when the time came to leave, I barely had any maps at all, which led to a lot of adventures that weren't necessarily comfortable at the time, but we'll get to those. So, where? So the first mountain range I walked the length of was the Apennines in Italy. It's like a range that's roughly 900 miles long, rises to almost 10,000 feet at the highest point. In places, it's very poor. There's lots of villages where people, you know, when I was there, they still plow their fields with a horse pulling a plow behind it. Most places in southern Italy don't see tourists. It was an interesting range to explore. In the south, for the first half of the walk, there were no trails because people don't go walking there, except in a couple of places. I chose this picture because it shows the forests. There were a lot of incredibly tangled forests to walk through, which wasn't expected because every other place I've walked in Europe has had a perfect hiking trail system to follow. And so that led to a lot of adventures. And again, we'll come to some of the stories in a little bit. The Apennines are better known when you reach a latitude level with Rome, I guess, when you get to the Abruzzo region, where finally you have mountains that rise above the trees, and there is kind of a tourist network. There's a few mountain refuges, a few campsites in the valleys. But even here, in a relatively well-known national park, I saw no one else out walking. For the length, I spent 4.5, 5 months in the Apennines, and I think I saw 3 people away from 1 mile of a parking area or a trailhead. So this is a range that most people don't think of for going to mountains in Europe. You think of the Alps or the Pyrenees, maybe Norway. There's so much fantastic mountain country that when I was there, you have to yourself. It feels like another Europe, a completely different Europe from the Italy that most people know. Like Rome is about 1.5 hours from this place. And yet I was there and a bear passed by my tent in the middle of the night. And I ran into wild boar and I felt like I was 100 miles from anywhere. And this is, you know, 1.5 hours from the thousands of people thronging the Sistine chapel. So the whole point of the walk was to visit these places that exist that most Europeans aren't even really aware of. So the second range, when I got to the top of the Apennines, I paced across the Po plain and jumped into the Alps. The Alpine stretch was about 1,000 miles. The Apennine stretch was like 1,800 miles. The first half of the Alpine stretch was fantastic. It was easy walking in dramatic landscapes. And because it was now, by this point, it was late September, moving into October, again, I had the Alps to myself. I'm sure many of you have been to the Alps to run and walk and climb and stuff, and you may think of the Alps as being pretty crowded. When I was there for what felt like an endless summer, because the season just stretched on and on, I had the place to myself again, and it kind of extended that feeling of being in a Europe separated from the Europe that most people know. Yeah, I was enjoying an endless summer in an alpine range that felt like a range that existed 150, 200 years ago. And it was, because there was no one else there, it was easy to immerse myself into what the range really was. And as most of you probably know, the Alps is like a mixture of rock types that were formed when the African plate pushed into the Eurasian plate, and it kind of folded and buckled them all over and mixed them all together. And you see that when you're walking through the mountains and you pay attention to the geology, when you're like tuned into what the landscape is, and being undistracted by other people made it easier to tune into the scale of the mountains and what they represented, which was a world that's kind of indifferent to us. It's, you know, it's such a powerful thing to feel it. And also to go up on the glaciers and really get a sense for what the Alps are. Although some people don't think it's wild, it really is. It really can be a wild mountain range. And especially when winter hits. Late October, winter finally began, and the journey changed in nature completely. Life became harder logistically, because it's okay when you go camping in the snow for a weekend or a week, but when it's week after week after week, things get wet and freeze up, and packing up camp takes 5 times as long as it does in summer, and it's very engaging, I guess. It's you become, what the world's doing to you isn't something you shut out at the end of the day. It doesn't become a minor inconvenience that you can sweep away off your garden path. It's something that you have to adapt to and bend to. And again, it makes the landscape feel a lot more real. And so I learned ways of dealing with it. I would meticulously dry out my tent in the morning with an old t-shirt or old socks or whatever I could find, just to make sure that when I pitched it again in the evening, I was at least starting from a dry place. But I spent a lot of the time cold and wet and uncomfortable, but also in awe of this kind of thing. So from the Alps, then I began walking across the top of Austria, then Germany, with a little bit in the Czech Republic, along a long line of lower forested mountains. And so I kind of considered this whole stretch of a journey an in-between stretch. I didn't really expect much from it. I thought it was just a piece of land I had to cross to link up, you know, the Alps and the Apennines with Norway. And I discovered another wild Europe that's, again, hidden to most outsiders. These forests, a lot of them are, you know, first growth forest that haven't ever really been touched. There are a few paths, but there's a lot of places where there aren't paths. And it was wonderful to discover this kind of ancient, primal forest system in the middle of Europe that, again, most people think is well developed and you can't have adventures there. And it was by this stage of a journey that I was really starting to feel, you know, after, I don't know, 9 months, 10 months of traveling, really starting to feel connected to the land. And the thing I realized is I ended up seeing Europe differently, I think, from most other people, because international borders ceased to really mean anything. It's like the major crossing points of a journey weren't when I crossed from one country to another. It was when I went from one mountain range to the next, or from one environment to another. And it made Europe seem more like a cohesive whole, like a real place, rather than something that was human dominated, like a real, you know, natural environment that I belonged to. So yeah, from those forests across the North German plain, I finally hit spring after, you know, 7, 8 months of winter. It seemed like a long winter, I can tell you. But of course, and from the top of the North German plain, spent a month walking up the Danish North Sea coast, which was essentially, 4 weeks walking up a beach, going inland occasionally. And it was beautiful to always sleep with the sound of the surf. It was also hard because it was constantly windy. The picture doesn't really hint it, but I tried an experiment. I stood on top of one of the dunes and faced north the way I was going, and the wind was blowing straight at me. So just to see, I turned around and faced south, and bizarrely, the wind was also blowing in my face from that direction too. So it was one of the windiest places I've ever been. And it was also a challenging part of the walk because I'd been essentially on my own, apart from a couple of visits from friends to join me, essentially being on my own for 10 months by this point. And I found my moods very impacted by how people treated me. If someone was helpful and kind, I was, floating 10 feet above the ground with happiness. But if someone was slightly mean or refused to help, I found myself rock bottom, which plays into one of the stories I'll tell in a little bit. So from Denmark, it was to Norway, which I always considered the prize. 6 months in amazing mountains. The challenge for the first 3 months of Norway was that I was back in winter again. The snow was deep, it didn't thaw, it rained a lot. I found myself deeply intimidated by the scale of the wilderness. And the challenge in Norway was to see if these mountains could ever come to feel like home too. There were moments, of course, because it was exceptionally beautiful, but it was really difficult to cross. And I don't know if you can see, I snowshoed the mountains, and there's my snowshoes, if you can see the cursor. They're not like the snowshoes that I have now, which leave your heel free to move and have claws underneath for biting into the snow for steep ground. They were just a basic latticework leather straps that my foot slotted to flat. And it was really hard going. It was really hard going. But eventually I made it to the far north of Norway, into the Arctic, which was where I really found what I'd been looking for all along, which was a sense of connection with the mountains beyond anything I ever imagined I would find. And I don't know if the space of this photo does anything that hints at that, but there was a sense of being at home here, of everything being the way it should be. It's impossible to describe. So that's where I walked. Why I walked there, I have a few more pictures from the places I walked, but why I walked there was because at the simplest level, I didn't feel like the way I was supposed to go through my life was the way society wanted me to go through life, and the way my parents wanted me to go through life, and the way school taught me to go through life was the way I wanted to go through life. I felt deep down that, school, college, work, mortgage, marriage, kids, little 2-week holidays, retiring at 65, by which point you're too old and spent and worn out to really do anything anyway, was the right way to live a life. I fell in love with mountains when I went on a family holiday in '85, became an obsessed backpacker when I went away to college in Derby, where Ollie first met me. I got a real job after college and spent every spare moment I could, every spare week, every 2-week holiday in the mountains. And I loved those trips, but they didn't seem to be enough until eventually I managed to fall 1,500 feet down a glacier in the Alps, which was not something I'd recommend. But for how it changed my approach to life, I'm eternally grateful for it, because I should have died. Essentially fell down a 1,500-foot glacier, which had a little ski jump at the bottom. And if I hadn't managed to stop myself, I would have, flown over the ski jump into a void into the Bernese Oberland, and that would have been that. Somehow I managed to survive. And as I was lying in hospital, I re-evaluated what was important to me and decided that following the path I was supposed to follow wasn't for me. I gave up work, went for a 6-month walk in the Alps, went back to work freelance, went for another 3-month walk, and that's when I finally came up with the idea for this journey. It was a journey so long that it wasn't just a walk, it was a way of life. It became my life for 1.5 years, more than just a walk. And so that's why I did it. I wanted to be true to who I was and not reach 65 and say, oh, I wish I'd done more. And the other why is because I feel that we're part of the world. Nature, the earth, the universe helped us evolve into the beings that we are. And we're not being true to ourselves when we're perpetually locked away from it, when we're inside a house, inside a car, inside a store or a movie theater, sitting in front of our computer screens. We're most human and most alive and most true to what we are when we are outside, fully engaged with the natural world. And that's what I wanted from the journey. I wanted to be true to who I was as an animal of the planet, and to experience as much of it as possible and to really connect to it. And I know it says to connect with the wild, myself, and the universe sounds kind of far out there and all hippie-ish, but it was what I was after. And as this photo perhaps hints, by the time I got to Arctic Norway, I may have achieved what I'd set out to find. So, to kind of tell the story of the walks briefly, I don't know how I'm doing for time because I forgot to start my stopwatch, but I learned a few things and I'm kind of going to use those to tell the story simply. From the very first step, I learned to let go of expectations. And so I chose this picture because I've just endured the longest winter of my life, from the middle of October, and now it's June. And here I am in Norway and it's still bloody snowing, which was annoying because I thought June was supposed to be summer. But like, it happened from the very first step. When I began in Calabria, I kind of expected mountains like I'd had in other Mediterranean mountain ranges, like Corsica or like the Pyrenees or whatever. You have mountains that stick up above the trees and the walking is easy and good, and it's a mountain walk. When I began the journey in Calabria, I discovered that even though the first area was a national park, there were no paths there. There were no mountains rising above the trees. It was a tangled jungle. And for the first week, I struggled to work against it because it wasn't what I expected it to be. I had this vision of what my perfect 18-month adventure was going to be, and battling through a forest and being forced to hike along a road wasn't what I wanted. But slowly, as the weeks and months went by, I learned that my job wasn't to fight against what I found, it was just to accept what I found and then work with it and live truly in it. And so I think you can see that's why I'm actually smiling in this picture, because I'm like, it's snowing. This is Norway. This is what Norway is supposed to be, and it's absolutely amazing here. So I learned that wisdom comes from unexpected places. And this is just an example. This isn't what you would expect Calabria to be, probably in May. This is 3 days into the journey, and I discovered that I had no idea where I was. Certainly the map thing. When I got to Calabria, the only map I had was a large-scale road map of the entire region that showed the coastline and a few towns along roads, and it showed barely anything of the interior where I was, just these little artistic sketch lines that were supposed to represent mountains. So I set out pretty much just on a compass bearing, the map useless, and spent 2 days in this forest, seeing no sign whatsoever of anyone or any sign of civilization. I wanted to climb the highest mountain in the range, couldn't find it, had no idea which direction it lay. It was stressful at this point because I wanted to know where I was. I was lost and wanted to be found, and so I didn't really appreciate what I was passing through at this early stage of a journey. When I finally got to the far side of this first range, it's called the Aspromonte, which translates as the rough mountain. And it was also exciting because incidentally, I was told as I was leaving the coast that the mafia still hide kidnapped victims up in this mountain range, which wasn't something I'd even considered because, I did no research because there was no research to be done. Knowing that I could run into a mafia stronghold deep in the forest freaked me out a little bit, I think it's fair to say. Fortunately, I didn't in this forest. But when I finally got to the far side after 2 days and finally met someone, it was a shepherd who was on a rough hillside with a small flock of sheep sitting there under his umbrella to keep the sun off. And I thought, finally, I can ask someone where I am. So I walked up to him, pulled out my map, kind of pointed to it with my bad Italian, asked where I was. And he didn't know either. It was hysterical. He had no idea where we were either, but I couldn't accept that. I said, so where are we? Where the hell are we? And again, I pointed to the map, and finally he looked at it carefully with his dirty fingers, and then looked up at me with wise, soulful eyes and said, "Siamo qui," we are here, which was either very simple or one of the most profound things anybody has ever said to me. And I think "we are here" is something to remember. So, self-reliance. So this is the Apennines a little further north. It's a good picture because it shows the extent of the forests and the mountains. I didn't really think about it at the time, but I didn't have a safety net. No one knew where I was at any time, where my route lay, because I didn't know where my route lay. I was making it up as I went. I couldn't leave a plan with someone to come and get me if things went wrong because I didn't have a plan. I had towns spaced roughly every 2 weeks apart, which had a little parcel full of things I didn't expect to get in the mountains that my parents sent out. My parents, who I affectionately called base camp throughout the whole trip, I phoned them every week to 10 days when I could find a phone. But for the most part, no one knew where I was. And if something had gone wrong in the forest, there's no way anyone would have found me. But I say I didn't really think about it at the time. I just took it for granted that I knew what I was doing. I was going to be careful. I was doing what I wanted to be doing and really didn't see that anything dangerous would occur. But it's interesting looking back now, thinking about the fact that I was just standing on my own 2 feet, and I was entirely reliant on myself. And I think without realizing it, I learned a lot about personal responsibility and taking care of myself from that, and seeing the world for how it really is in some ways. So a typical Apennine hilltop villages. The villages were amazing. I loved them. So many of them weren't built for cars. They're built for feet, because you have all these steep alleyways twisting through them. I came up with this one because this was the first mafia encounter I had in this village. I was walking down the street, was going to buy a few resupply supplies, and these 3 gentlemen were walking down towards me, and they were straight out of a Godfather movie. You know, big suits, very severe attitudes, scowling scar faces, clearly not locals because it was kind of a poor place. And some fool inside of me decided it would be a hoot to try and engage them in conversation. So, you know, they were coming towards me. I walked level and I just turned to them and said, "Buongiorno, come sta?" And only one of them turned to look at me. And he turned to look at me with this scowl that said, "Don't you ever talk to us again." So I thought, lesson learned, don't talk to the mafia. And so I had 2 other kinds of encounters. One was when I was heading up a dirt road towards a trailhead path that led into the mountains again. And just as I reached the end, a police car pulled up, coming, you know, towards me. And they told me that I really shouldn't cross that mountain because there are molti criminali up there. Very, very pericoloso, men with guns. You go the other way. So I kind of had no choice when the police said to go the other way. And then at another trailhead a day later, I reached it, and there were 2 SUVs parked at the end, shiny new compared to anything else I'd seen in Italy at that point. And 2, you know, muscled, casually dressed men were leaning against their cars. And I approached, they seemed friendly enough. They had lots of questions about the journey. We had a good conversation. One of them amazingly spoke English, which is about one of 3 people I found before I got to the Abruzzo who spoke English. When they finally asked where I was going, and I kind of pointed beyond them, they kind of folded their arms and were like, "No, it's better you go another way." So again, I had no choice but to go another way. So the most exciting encounter was when I was camped in a beautiful beech forest, fast asleep. Birds were probably singing. I wasn't aware of it. I was still asleep. But then suddenly I was pulled from sleep with such suddenness that I found myself sitting up in my tent. I wasn't even aware of sitting up. And what pulled me from sleep was this blood-curdling scream, and then a whole bunch of shots ringing out. You know, rat-a-tat-tat-tat. And the forest was silent suddenly again. And I thought, had I just dreamt that? No, it was real. What the hell just happened? Was it hunters? But why the scream before they started shooting? Were people out for target practice? Why would they do that here in the middle of nowhere? And eventually I decided it was probably a good idea to not investigate and to get the hell out of there quickly. So I packed up my camp really quickly and quietly, making sure that no pots and spoons or tent pegs made any noise. And then I stole through the forest really quietly, making sure I didn't stand on any twigs. Because, you know, like in movies, someone always stands on a twig and then all hell breaks loose. That wasn't me. After 50 yards, I came to a earth road that I hadn't known existed. And down the end of it were 5 black, shiny, dark-tinted, windowed SUVs. No one around that I could see. And so I decided that I wouldn't go down and ask what the gunfire was about. I just stole across the road and disappeared back into the trees and carried on walking, thinking, you know, it's good to be curious, but sometimes it's not good to be curious. So, to embrace chance. As I said, I had challenges with maps for most of southern Italy, which meant I was often lost. Eventually I came to accept being lost was okay. By the time I got to this mountain range, it's only like a 3 days to cross it, but I didn't even have a map for this range. And I decided just walking, I had like a map of the whole of Italy, so I knew roughly how things were arranged. But I just decided to set out across the mountain range with no map, because I could see where I was going, and what would happen would happen. That's kind of like the whole point of the journey, was adopting this attitude to go from everything wanting to match my expectations to be willing to let chance lead the way and embrace the delight of the unpredictable lifestyle. And there was, even by the time I'd successfully crossed this range and there were finally paths to follow, I had a lucky coin. And whenever I came to a path junction and it wasn't really clear which way I should go, I'd always pull out my coin and flip it. Heads I go right, tails I go left. And it never let me down. It always led somewhere interesting. And even when I was lost, I eventually came to learn that it didn't matter that I wasn't where I'd wanted to be. I was here, and here was plenty good enough. So learning to face my fears. On the map, this was a broad ridge that should have been hands in pockets walking. And then it turned out to be this long succession of airy limestone pinnacles, which, crossing with an unwieldy backpack, you know, 60-pound rucksack on your back, isn't necessarily the smartest thing to do. And ever since falling down that mountain 4 years earlier, I'd been terrified of any kind of exposure. But I didn't want to go back for 5 or 6 miles and lose that distance. So I just decided to tackle it and see what happened. And halfway along, I discovered it was actually pretty easy. The handholds were huge. There was no reason for me to fall off. And it was one of the funnest stretches of the summer, just scrambling along this airy ridge. And I think I whooped and screamed and laughed with delight, because it wasn't so bad, the thing I'd been so scared of. And so that applied to lots of parts of the journey, and I guess it still applies to life itself. Okay, small steps counts, experiences add up. Oh, no, and I hope all these things that I learned, I'm not coming across as trying to share this great wisdom that I think everybody should follow. It's just, it was part of the journey, and this is the stuff that I learned that works for me, and that's all I can say about it. I learned a lot from the journey, and it's definitely made my life better, so I'm throwing it out there for whatever reason. So clearly, when you stand on the highest mountain in the range and look back down it and look ahead, you can see that something as small as a footstep really adds up. It's such a tiny thing, but with it, you can walk from one length of the continent to another. And it helped me break down future tasks in my life to just small steps. All you can do is what you can do right now. And it certainly helps as a parent when kids feel overwhelmed, to try and remind them that, yeah, if you don't start, you'll never make any progress. Just do what you can do. But the thing I most thought about on this summit was how it was an amazing summit. I had the mountain to myself. It was one place where I would have seen lots of other walkers if I'd have gone at the normal time of day. Instead, I climbed it by moonlight and sat on the top, and the mountain turned into this glowing pinnacle of light that felt detached from the rest of the world. And the level of elation, again, words cannot really describe it. And as I climbed down, I realized that I was changed a tiny bit because of this experience, because of the altered perspective being on this mountain gave me. And I realized that every single part of the journey, difficult and exciting, was still part of who I was, and it added up. And it made me realize that as you live through life, you become a accumulation of all the things that have happened to you. And if you choose some of the things that you want to happen to you, just makes you into a different person. And it's something you have I felt I had a conscious choice over. So further north in the Apennines, I came across a lot of shepherds. Interestingly, none were Italian. Most were from the Balkans. Very few spoke English. Most of them were refugees from the Bosnian Wars a few years earlier, right before this. But they were the happiest people I've ever met, despite the trauma they'd been through, maybe because of the trauma they'd been through. They all laughed and smiled. There was one who I spoke with who just walked up to me in a rainstorm and just stood there shaking my hand with happiness. I'm saying, my friend, and it was pouring, and he was drenched, and he was just kind of like giggling like a madman. But there was this light in his eyes that showed that the months he'd spent up in the mountains had made him different from others. There was a shepherd similar to this one who took me in for the night and let me stay in his little shepherd's hut with him. And we had a wonderful evening. He fed me, gave me lots of beer. We hadn't a single word. We could talk to each other. So we spoke by drawing little pictures in a notepad and had ourselves in stitches of laughter. It was, demonstration that people generally want to get on, and if we smile and laugh, we can get on. And it's only one of the shepherds. I like this little story. The Pennines there were a lot of flies there. It looks perfect, and I don't have a picture of them. Lots of mosquitoes in the forest, which made camping horrible. Lots of black flies and horse flies in places like this. One particular fly, I didn't know it was a horse fly at the time, but they were huge, and when they landed, you never felt it. And when they stuck their proboscis into you, it was like a proboscis, like a medieval lance. It would stick into you, and a trickle of blood would come down your arm, and you jump 6 feet in the air. I didn't know what they were, and I hated them. I called them terror flies, because that's kind of what they did. I finally found a shepherd who gave me the name of these flies, and I said, these flies, what are they called? And he kind of looked around with a harassed sort of air and said, these flies, they are bastardi. So I guess that's the local name, bastardi. Okay, into the Alps. To take nothing for granted. I guess it's pretty simple. I was thirsty a lot in the southern Apennines. I was lost a lot. Sometimes I went hungry. I was often tired. The weather was often not pleasant. I was alone. And so all these things changed the way I looked at things that back home before in my life I'd taken for granted, like walking into the kitchen, turning the tap and water comes out, or having a soft bed to lie down in, or having friends you can just go on a computer and Zoom with. Going without for a long period of time is the most fantastic thing for what it does to how you look at those things around you. I learned to stop and do nothing. For many of us, I know for me back in the real world, except I always thought this was the real world, and what we're in now is not the real world, but sometimes it's hard to make time to stop and just do nothing, just to sit and look and soak up the world around you. And so I spent a huge amount of time on the journey just doing this, just sitting there and doing nothing and communing with the land around me. And if you think about it, for 2/3 of every day, probably more, I wasn't walking. I was in one location, just sitting there in camp. It was my favorite thing, to get to the end of the day and sit in camp and just be present. And even when I was walking, I would stop and just look at things for an hour. And it's something to remember to do that is worth doing even now when we're busy, is just take 10 minutes and go outside and do nothing. And it's essential. One other thing, I was also very good on this journey about not making my day's goal. Basically, I'd look at my map when I had one, plan the day's end, plan roughly where I was going to walk. But on so many occasions, I'd be a mile into the day and I'd come across a perfect spot for camping. And so I had to stop, because one of my mottos was never walk past a good campsite. which is probably why it took me 18 months to walk the length of Europe rather than the 7 months that I was told it should take. But there you go, that was my approach. So a day without awe is a day wasted, kind of says it all, really. To experience, to go out into nature and be awed and be scared, to feel it, to marvel at it, is what makes life worth living. And the frustrating thing in some ways for this slideshow was some of the best moments couldn't be photographed because I didn't have the gear and the film speed and the technique. I couldn't photograph the fireflies dancing in the Apennine forests at night. I couldn't photograph the nightingale that interrupted sleep once when I was camped in an olive grove, and for an hour it serenaded me in the darkness, and it was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. There was a night in the Alps when I camped in the forest. It was in winter. All these cobwebs were hanging down from the trees, and a snowstorm came in, these big fluffy flakes, and they caught on these hanging cobwebs to make these amazing, it was like a forest of crystal chandeliers. I don't know if you've watched Frozen with your kids, but it was like something from that. And after the snowstorm had stopped, I walked through it after dark in the moonlight, and it just blew my mind, this forest of sparkling silver snow chandeliers. I couldn't photograph that. And the northern lights in northern Norway. Again, photos don't do it justice, because I'd seen photos of the northern lights and I thought they just hung there. When I was in northern Norway and I saw the northern lights, they danced across the sky in a way I hadn't expected. And again, it was one of those beautiful things that I'll just take with me forever. Okay, so I kind of wanted the journey to be a myth in my own mind. It was like the Lord of the Rings to me. Like I was a hobbit on some fantastic legendary adventure, but I also wasn't taking it that seriously. And I often laughed at myself for the idiot I was, being out there soaked to the skin, camping in snow, doing this when I could have been back at home living in comfort. And it kind of ties back to, I mentioned I had a stammer earlier, which is mostly gone now. This was right into Austria. And when I dropped to my first German town of Meyerhofen, my stammer kind of came to the front, because I turned up, walked into a pub. I wanted something warm to eat, something to drink. It was kind of like something from a spaghetti western. I stepped into the pub, and the music and everyone stopped, and all the heads looked in my direction, and I felt kind of the center of everything. Eventually the heads all turned away, and I stomped over to the bar, leaving a trail of puddles and snow behind me, and sat down on a stool. And this old Austrian man kind of came over and sat on the stool next to me, and spoke to me in German. I only had about 50 words of German at that point, and asked me essentially, what the hell are you doing? You know, you don't get many hikers walking in covered in snow in the middle of November in that part of Austria. Probably any part, I don't know. And so I tried to answer. I kind of prepared my answer in German, and I can't remember what it was now. I know that part of it was going to say Zufus, by foot, but when I came to the Z, I suddenly got stuck with my stammer and couldn't get past it. And so I was like, struggling without actually speaking to get this noise out. And the poor Austrian thought that I was about to impart some amazing secret, that I was going to whisper something. So he kind of inched a little bit closer and a little bit closer. And the poor guy, I would have warned him if I could to keep back, but I was engaged in the epic battle to get my word out. And when finally it came, it was with an explosion of sound, really loud. The poor German guy kind of jumped backwards, almost fell off his bar stool, spilt half his beer, and looked at me like, that was a dirty, rotten sort of trick. But it kind of illustrates, I had a stammer, and I found out eventually that laughing at that kind of thing, when things go wrong, laughing always helps. So I learned that discomforts don't last. This was when I was getting towards the end of crossing the Alps. I had a really rough week before leaving the Alps. It was really bad weather. I was down in the valley a lot. Everything was soaked to the skin. My gear was all wet. It wasn't really working very well by this point. I decided I didn't want to leave the Alps defeated, so I climbed up to cross one final mountain. And so climbing up here, my gear was all soaking wet. So when I finally stopped to camp, it turned into instant iron, and I came as close as I've ever come to turning into a giant ice cube. But I'd learned by this point that, so I was cold now, eventually I'd be warm again. in the southern part of the walk, when I was hot and thirsty, I kind of learned, well, I'll find water one day. And eventually I did. You know, the worst storm comes through, but you know, eventually the sun's going to come out after it. So it was just a lesson that made bearing all of the journey's discomforts easier, is knowing they wouldn't last. And eventually I reached a point where the discomforts was something that were kind of embraced because of that, because of how they would make future pleasures even greater. So camp in the northern German forests, just a plain old meadow with a few trees around it. Something that, you know, happens every single day in winter there, an ordinary kind of day, I guess, except as the photo perhaps demonstrates was, to me, it wasn't ordinary at all. I discovered the longer the walk went on, that I could find extraordinary in a small leaf lying on the ground, in a piece of moss, in just the way a cloud was moving, and in the way a breeze touched my face. And being aware that there is no ordinary, even now, like, I mean, how extraordinary is this? And I'm able to share this story with you 5,000 miles away, and in the case of New Zealand, 12,000 miles away. And even when we're in lockdown and we can't go to the places we want to go to, there's probably a patch of rough ground somewhere nearby. And if you get down on your hands and knees and really look at it and rummage in it with your fingers, it's not ordinary at all. And that's definitely something the journey taught. I learned that nature isn't an adversary. I was brought up to believe that we were kind of separate from nature as a species, that mountains were things to conquer, that seas were there to swallow up ships and forests were there to be lost in. But I eventually came to discover that actually getting engaged in the worst weather, in the worst mountains, and throwing yourself open to the wind and the snow makes you more alive, instead of hiding from it, to embrace it and making it part of you. And that's what I was doing here. It was a fearsome blizzard, and I dumped my pack behind a tree where I hoped I could find it again in an hour's time, and climbed up through the fog to a high summit. And it was an intense journey into the photo fails to show the wind and share the noise of the roaring of the wind roaring through the pines and the snow flinging against my face. And it wasn't comfortable, but it was so invigorating and so fulfilling. Okay, so some German friends. As I mentioned earlier, by the time I got to Denmark, I was at the mercy of how other people treated me, because I'd been on my own so long. And I came to learn that even something like a scowl or a smile could make a difference in my life. I had so many people who really helped me, like this family who took me in, and so many people who could have helped me who chose not to and seemed miserable because of it. And since the journey, since realizing how powerful a stranger's smile or simple act could be, I make it a point that every single encounter I have with another human being, whether I'm in a car and they're in a car, or whether they're the cashier in a supermarket, every single encounter at that moment is the most important thing at that moment. And every one is an opportunity to make the world a better place. And the walk definitely taught me that. And this is worth sharing just because this was a particularly good example of hospitality. These people took me under their wing. I turned up in a remote pub just to get water so I'd have a comfortable camp. I didn't have to thaw snow. They saw me, invited me over for a beer. When they learned what I was doing, they invited me back to their house, along with their two parents who aren't in this picture. They fed me, they gave me somewhere warm to sleep. They let me use the shower, because I probably wasn't the sweetest smelling thing for most of the journey. And it was just amazing to have strangers treat me like one of the family. On the walk back to the house, I was talking about how much I missed Scottish single malt whiskey. So they piled me into their car and we drove to the nearest supermarket and came back bearing a bottle of Talisker. And I remember this guy in the middle, Carl, who was the personality of the family, 21, but hard as nails, lots of energy. I remember him coming back and crashing the bottle down on the table and said, "Right, we kill this bottle tonight." And of course we did. We got through it. Several friends came over. We had an amazing game of cards called Konig, I think it was called, King, something. Embarrassingly, even though I had no idea what I was doing, I kept winning every single hand, which was funny. But eventually, in a mock Teutonic rage, Carl got up from a table and "I have had enough!" He works as a butcher. He walked out to like an extra room, came back in with this massive belt, this butcher's belt, hanging with all kinds of hooks and saws and knives and medieval torture instruments, crashed it down on the table in mock Teutonic anger and said, "Right, this time I win the game." And of course he did, with this big knife in front of him. It was funny. But it was a brilliant night. It was a brilliant evening, and I had so many moments where people took me in as though I was one of the family, and it was an extraordinary thing. So learn to trust that it will work out. As I mentioned, I didn't have funds. Throughout the journey, little earnings trickled into my bank account from stories I wrote from the trail, from selling a few pictures from the photo library I had. By the time I got to this part of Denmark, I thought I only had 2 weeks of hiking left. But then the photo library I was sending the slides back to, who were developing them for me, managed to sell one for £600, which was like, whoa, I suddenly have 3 months more walking. And so through starting when I didn't think I could finish, just because if I didn't start, I never would, somehow it worked out. That doubt, that tension of not knowing if I could make it financially, somehow I was able to keep going. And it was an extraordinary thing. And although I knew I didn't have funds, the funniest thing from the first step of the journey, I never had any doubt that I would get to the last day at North Cape. There was no way I wasn't going to make it. Although there were low points in the journey, I never imagined not succeeding, because it wasn't really essentially a difficult undertaking. I mean, it was long, but it was no more than a bunch of day hikes joined together. It was something that anybody could do if they do it at a sensible and slow pace. So that leap of faith to start something that perhaps financially seemed impossible paid off. Okay, not a serious one. My tent, I had a tent for the Apennines, a small lightweight one. I got a new tent for the Alps. By the time I got to Norway, that new tent was not really working. And it let in so much water, I named the tent Old Leaky, because that's what it did. Whenever it rained, I used to have to stuff socks in the corner to soak up all the puddles. It often felt like I was leaking out a bailing boat. It was so wet. But it was all part of a journey, dealing with inadequate equipment and making light of it. And funnily enough, I still use the same tent here in Colorado 23 years later, just because I use it in winter when it snows, and so it doesn't leak because of the snow. And in summer, it doesn't even rain here. So if you treat things well, they last. Okay, the best route is not a straight line. Like I say, I could have probably walked the length of Europe, or someone could in 6 months, maybe less if they decided to turn it into a race. But this wasn't about racing. It was about visiting the special places that were hidden, about taking the longest route possible. And I came up with a little equation, a little mathematical equation that summed up my approach. And it was something like, how's it go? I've completely forgotten it now. My mind's gone blank. The shortest distance between any 2 points is equivalent to a wasted opportunity. That sums up my approach to the mountains. Don't go in straight lines, take the longest route you can. I learned that we get second chances. This is in Norway now. Norway scared me. Although I'd spent a year in the wilderness, it was on a manageable scale. The space and immensity of Norway intimidated me to such a level, and it was so hard with the snow on the tops that I'd often drop down to the valleys and take an easier route. And I wasn't being completely true to who I wanted to be. I wanted to follow a high mountain route, and sometimes I didn't. But I learned throughout the journey and from this that next time I wake up, I can go back up to the mountains and try again. And so this is something I adopt now in my life every morning when I wake up, and I still do this. And all of this probably sounds really cliched and trite, but every morning when I wake up, I say to myself, so today I get another chance to be the very best version of myself I can be. And again, this journey taught me that. And I think it's true. And this is an example why Norway was intimidating. heading off alone when it's 20 degrees and the snow is soft and swallowing you whole, and you know, you sink up to your knees even in snowshoes, and there's 30 miles of this stretching ahead. It's scary and it's hard, and sometimes I did retreat from it and took an easier route. And one of the things I like about the mountains and the wilderness is it's all very well to be back at home planning something amazing and in your own eyes being this, you know, adventurer, this amazing achiever. When you get out into the mountains, you're found out. You can't be what you're not. And it was wonderful to learn how hard it was and how sometimes I did retreat. And when you know your limitations, you really know yourself. When you really push hard and go to places that are scary, you learn a lot from it about who you are. And I think it's the saddest thing to go through life and not know who you are. It means more when you've earned it, right? I was 15 months into the journey by this point. I battled for 3 months with snow-covered southern Norway. I pushed through emotional highs and lows. When I got to this point, the final mountain range in southern Norway, that really is a mountain range, everything suddenly clicked and came together. And I could have merged into the rock and the soil at my feet with contentment. I felt so at home there. And it was special because of all of the hardships that had led to it, all the distance, all the highs and lows. And so when things are rough, it makes the times that are good better. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from the journey. If you put that work in, if you push on when you don't feel like it, eventually the rewards come, and they are greater for everything you've gone through. Things easily won don't mean anything. Change is the only guarantee, of course. Nature teaches that. I knew the journey wouldn't last. I know this life won't last. I think about that every day, pretty much. Ollie, you hinted at that in your talk, and it's true. It's such an incredible, precious thing we have, and to keep it in constant mind is so essential for making life richer. And knowing that the walk wouldn't last, knowing that every single moment was such a fleeting thing, just made it all the more powerful, all the more special. Self-explanatory, I think. The meaning of life is to live a life of meaning. And it's different for all of us. I think this picture sums up that I was living a life that meant everything to me. That's all I can say about it. You find your own meaning, and if you live it, life is as good as it can be. Europe is bigger and wilder than most people know. I think I mentioned that. I was searching for the other Europe, and it exists. People don't think it does. People think there's no wilderness left. There's a lot of wilderness. In this instance, it was a forest in the Czech Republic that was essentially saved because of the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain ran very close to this, and no one was allowed into this area for 40 years. And then it had reopened a few years before I got there. And it was pristine, mountain, forest, wilderness. And incidentally, I wasn't supposed to be here. It was kind of called the Forbidden Zone back then, and you weren't allowed to camp in it. It later turned out there's a reason, because some of it was probably still mined. But I didn't know that. I think I kind of got lucky. I tried to cross into the Czech Republic and was turned back at the border because I told them I was going to camp, and I didn't realize you couldn't. And they said, no, not allowed. If you can't tell me where you're staying, you have to go back into Austria. But I managed to sneak over a little later and spent a week walking through this, although dodging the border patrols added a certain tension to it. But it was an amazing area. But there's so much of Europe that's still like this. Okay, perhaps my rucksack was too heavy. There I am at the North Cape, and I think I'm, clearly done. It was a good day to finish. And funnily enough, it was exactly how I pictured it from the very first step. I always imagined myself walking across a snow-covered headlands to the top of Europe above a dark sea, and the final day was like a gift. It was like that reward that was earned because of everything I'd done. And it sounds fanciful, and obviously it would have been what it would have been no matter what, but so many good moments on the journey happened in such a theatrical way with such perfection, and it felt like it was because I'd earned them. It was the funniest thing. All right, I think there's 5 more pictures. We're almost there. So loneliness. Before I took a long walk, I was never lonely in the mountains. It was, you know, always fun and easy, and even a 2-week walk, I was never lonely. But this journey was so long that sometimes loneliness hit. It hit first off when my brother and a friend came to join me for a week in the Dolomites, and we'd laugh so much. You can't really laugh when you're on your own, but because you know it's kind of strange if you do. But when you're in company, you know, laughter was one of the things I missed, and company was one of the things I missed, and it was incredible. But when they left, I like plunged into this hole. The walk didn't make sense anymore. I blubbered like a child. And I'm sure, you know, real explorers with more emotional strength wouldn't do that. Like polar explorers and Edmund Hillary probably didn't blubber when he left to go climb Mount Everest, whatever. But I discovered, despite being a solitary person by nature, that I actually did need other people. The deepest loneliness was Christmas. I guess because I was a sucker for what Christmas should be, for family time, for, you know, snowflakes falling outside, for, you know, everything being nice and warm and cozy. I always had this knowledge that Christmas would be perfect. For some reason, I thought Christmas alone in the snow-covered North German woods would be really romantic, and I would deal with it just fine. Well, the first thing was the snow melted, so I didn't even get my first white Christmas. It rained, and it was foggy, and it was cold and dark. And then when Christmas finally approached, I just fell to pieces. It was as low as I've ever been in my life. It was like a panic. It was like I couldn't stand being awake. It was a really intense thing. And I never imagined from this point on the walk would be fun at all. It was over. It was done. I would continue because I knew I wouldn't give up. There was no danger of the walk not finishing, but I couldn't see any pleasure in it whatsoever because I was alone, and I realized I needed my family and I loved them, and it was quite something to realize. And that taught a lot about the importance of having other people in my life. And what was funny was, having gone through that and reaching that realization, the next morning, again, it felt like the gift. The next morning I woke up and it was snowing and it was beautiful and the trees were frosted. And I wasn't lonely. It was completely gone, as though it had never existed. The gift of experiencing it took me to a whole new place. And from that point onwards, for the rest of my life and for the rest of the journey, loneliness completely lost its power over me. It was an extraordinary thing. Freedom. I think this picture, however cheesy it is, this kind of selfiness of it summed up how I felt. This was the first big mountain ridge after 2.5 months of dealing with southern Italy, which was rough and hot and steamy and mosquito-y. And suddenly I was free on a mountain ridge. And down in the valleys, people were hot and their shirts were probably sticking to their backs. And life was, you know, steamy and miserable. Up here, I was free to walk along the mountain ridge and gather up snowballs and throw it over the edge and sing and dance and scream at the top of my voice like a raving lunatic if I wanted. And there was no one here to judge me and no one to care. And it's an incredible feeling to create that life, create that meaning, and then live it. And I just put that in because it sums up. And there were so many moments on the journey when I was free to be who I was meant to be. And a similar picture, I think I take too many arms wide pictures, but there you go. In Arctic Norway, the space and the way the journey evolved and led to it, I connected with the land in a way that I can't describe. And there were so many moments when I couldn't tell you where I ended and the land began. And it's an incredible thing to feel part of something bigger, that's never ending, and you're a part of it, and you know you're a tiny part, but you're also an essential part of it, and you're not just part of it, it is you. And there was a stretch, the final 6 weeks of the journey were so perfect because of everything that had led to them. I'm still feeling what I had there. Whenever I look at the pictures, I just know that everything is going to be okay. And again, words fail because emotions are beyond words. and connecting with the universe is beyond words. And I like this photo because it kind of sums it up. There's this space, and it's home. So gratitude. I'm hot, southern Italy, sweaty, mobbed by flies, my feet hurt, I'm thirsty, but I'm grateful for what I'm doing. I'm grateful that I have been thirsty, because now when I go to the next village, I'll be able to collect water, and then when I drink again, water's going to be better because I'm drinking it. And although there's millions of mosquitoes, it's going to mean when I get in my tent at night and I don't have mosquitoes bugging me, that's going to feel really nice. And when my feet hurt, I'm grateful for that, because it means I walked far enough today. And so all these bad things I learned, to turn them into things to be grateful for. And now I'm grateful, even though I haven't been on a long walk like this, because I've been married and I have kids, and I made that choice. I'm grateful that I was able to do this walk, and I'm grateful that I'm doing that walk right now as I talk about it to you. So gratitude is one of the greatest gifts from the journey. This is the biggest one for me. Happiness, such a bland word. This is in Arctic Norway. It was a rough day, really windy, raining torrents on and off. I had to ford numerous rivers. Some of them were bigger than this. My feet and clothes were constantly wet. I just took this picture because, you know, I wanted to capture something of the moment. But I was so damn happy up there. It was perfect. I was doing exactly what I wanted to do in this most amazing place where there were no paths and no other people. I reached a level of happiness that I didn't expect, I didn't know existed for 2 weeks. You know, like that moment when that runner's high you get when you finished a long run and you're running back down the final few meters and the sun is setting and shining at you and you just feel good. It was like that, but it lasted without break. Previously, I'd had moments of elation and they last for a few hours and then they fade. But this hit and it lasted for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and it kind of returned. And I learned that happiness has no upper limit. When you really reach that level of happiness, it can't be measured. It can't be contained. And the cool thing is when you felt that, when I know that it's possible. So even when things are bad, I know that that happiness exists. And it's that single thing more than anything, knowing what's possible, changed my life forever. And it doesn't take much to step back into that moment. I wish I could share it. I really do. Okay, last picture, final realization. I have lots of friends who have done long journeys and then they go through periods of depression afterwards because they're not on the journey anymore, and adjusting to real life is hard. But I discovered for me that the journey never ends, that everything, that cumulative experience thing, everything experienced on the journey is still with you. Every lesson is still there. Every moment you can travel back to in your mind. And so applying those lessons, living in the moment, finding that there is no ordinary, being grateful for everything you have, makes life the most incredible thing. I'm still in shock that we exist, that we have what we have, that we can be who we are and experience the things we can experience. And this photo from about 10 years ago now, my kids are a lot bigger, but it kind of sums it up. This is something that was, I would have run 1,000 miles from when I was an obsessed backpacker to be stuck in a house with 2 kids, and I can't just take off into the mountains. But moments like this are as good as anything that ever happens in the mountains. And I think perhaps I appreciate them because of the long journeys and the various discomforts. But that's it. The journey goes on. Every single run, or you feel on them, it's still with you. When you're in lockdown, those magical moments you've experienced and will experience again, hopefully, are all still there. And so, yeah, that's it. That's my little slideshow. I don't know if I really summed up the journey or not. I would love to answer some questions. I do have like a 2-minute presentation with a few more images to just flick through to show some variation of Europe, but I don't care if we don't do it, entirely up to you. Maybe you've seen enough to know that Europe is a lot wilder than you imagined. Maybe you already knew it, I don't know. But that's it. That was what I did to avoid work.
And Andrew, hopefully you can hear me, Andrew. That was absolutely amazing. Sorry, you're still there.
I'm still here.
You've had a whole slew of questions, so I'm just conscious if we even cover just a few questions, that might be better use. Just looking at the time.
Sure, absolutely, perfectly right.
And I think what I might do, if this is okay with everybody, is I might copy and paste the questions we don't get to and send them to you, and then you can answer them in an email, and I'll send them around everybody just so everybody gets.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Gets an answer. There's some really good questions, but selfishly, I'm going to jump in with my question first, Andrew. You had some really wise words and profound observations. And one of the ones that struck me was having a sense of awe in everything, and that came across very, very clearly. How do you cope, particularly living in America, with the way that the word awe and awesome has been taken over, and people will describe really quite ordinary things as being completely awesome? You know, my job is awesome, my day is awesome. How do you cope? What do you think when somebody says that to you?
Well, on one hand, it goes back to there is no ordinary, right? So something that maybe seems mundane, maybe it isn't. Maybe it is extraordinary. So perhaps awesome, if people are really mindful and open to it fully, then maybe that is awesome. I don't know. I don't really care that people misuse awesome or misuse the word love or other words. I don't really I guess I don't think about what other people do and how they apply it. I just know that being awed by nature, by reality, by seeing someone doing something good for someone else, that's just important to me. And if someone says, so I went to see a movie and it was awesome, I just think, awesome, I probably want to see that. So, it's non-judging, I think, is the answer. Doesn't matter what other people say. Don't judge them. Just if they're happy, they're happy.
That's a lovely answer. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read every third question, because you've had more questions than anybody else has had in the history of these webinars. And the ones I don't get to, I will email to you, Andrew.
That's perfect.
You can answer those. So starting at the most recent from Ingrid Marshall. Do you think this experience has helped prepare you for the pandemic and lockdown, both practically and psychologically?
Yeah, definitely. I kind of feel guilty that I'm so happy to have my family around and unable to escape back to their jobs and school. I feel guilty that I'm so happy when so many people are suffering. It's like you do what you can, but you can't. I kind of feel powerless to help other people. But I don't care that I can't travel up to the High Rockies one bit, because I have some amazing local hills to explore on foot. I don't care that I have to wear a mask when I go to the food store, because I'm grateful that I have a food store to go to and there's still food in it. I love that I can get to know, as I kind of already done anyway, that my local terrain like the back of my hand or better, and spend so much time out there. In this pandemic hasn't changed a thing for me, because I can still live the life I want to live. Every single day I get up and, as I say, be the best version of myself I can be with what I have. I can't change it, so why worry about it? And I know I have choices in all things, right? Even the things you can't control, you have a choice with how you deal with it. As an example, like let me start again. I could miss Scotland so much. I could miss Cornwall. I could miss English pubs. I could miss so much about where I come from. but that's pointless, to dwell on what you don't have. It doesn't achieve anything. What I try and do is, and occasionally I'm not perfect, sometimes I really do miss those things and feel that ache inside, but mostly I concentrate on what I do have. And I think that's maybe what we can do during the pandemic, is just feel gratitude for the things we do have. And if we look closely, we'll discover that many of those things perhaps are enough.
It's brilliant, Andrew. I can see you writing a book on mindfulness and it being a bestseller. So 3 questions up, we get to Jamie Taylor. Andrew, thanks so much for a lovely talk and for your very moving honesty. Your photos are also incredibly good. That's not a question, so I'll skip up again. From Kathy and Lewis, were you ever scared?
Yeah, I think so. I think I was scared that morning when I woke up and after the gunshots had gone off, obviously. I think the deepest scare was, I was scared in Norway because of the scale and the commitment, the scale of a landscape and the commitment needed to cross it. The most intense moment of fear was when I was crossing the Hardangervidda, this big plateau in southern Norway, like Europe's biggest, emptiest above tree line plateau. And there was one spot at the end of a really hot day, the snow was really soft. I had to cross a roaring torrent, which was coming out of a glacier. And there were 3 snow bridges, each one worse than the one before. And it was the only way to really go. And snowshoeing across these things, when you could hear this torrent roaring away underneath the snow that I could break through to at any point, was intense. I've never felt so out on a limb. And across that whole of that Hardangervidda crossing, I hadn't grown comfortable with Norway yet. So every time I was up in the mountains, I was deeply unsettled inside and unable to relax. I was scared of the effort because it was so hard in the crappy snowshoes I had and the heat. There was another moment when, at the end of a really long day, I was suffering from I just want to get there disease and wasn't really thinking straight. And I decided to snowshoe across a lake, which had deep snow on it, but it was slightly bluish and it was all thawing. And up until that point, I carefully avoided every single lake I could see, because Norway has like 500,000 mountain lakes. And when they're buried under snow and it's thawing, they're not the safest thing to walk across. But I was tired and hot and just wanted to get there. And I walked across this lake, and then halfway across, I came to my senses, and I was, what are you doing? You've got a 70-pound dumbbell on your back, and if you break through, you're going to the bottom, and that's it. And that shock, that sudden frisson of I could die now, was fairly memorable, I would say. And it was funny how the second half of the crossing, it was like something from a nightmare, because the more I walked, the more the shore seemed to recede in front of me as I was going towards it. So yeah, there were lots of moments kind of like that. But it's funny now, I don't think I would look at fear in the same way. I wish I could do the journey again, and maybe I will one day, because I kind of accept that things are what they are. Fear is, I guess I approach it differently. I'm not scared of the future. I'm not scared. I'm curious to see how the current situation will play out, but whatever happens, I'm not scared of it, because it will be what it will be, and being scared of it won't achieve anything. So yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, look, I'm conscious of time, so the last question should have been Kathy and Lewis, but they've already had one. So I'm going to go one down. I'm going to embarrass Mark's lovely wife, Fiona Hartree, because I know that she didn't write this. Because the question is actually 3 questions. What was the most useful item that you used? What was the most useful item you used and would always take with you again, other than condoms?
I didn't have any condoms. I didn't have any condoms and didn't use any. So yeah, that's a whole nother story.
You don't need to go there. I suspect Fiona not that interested. It may not.
I'm not really a gearhead. I don't get excited about mountaineering gear. It's just stuff I use. maybe my camera, because it allowed me to share the journey now. It's really hard. I mean, there's nothing that we have that's a thing that we need. So the most useful stuff was the stuff I carried with me inside. Like everything you need is inside. You don't need, the best pair of running shoes that are going to make you the fastest runner ever, or that GPS unit, or so when you ask that question, I actually can't think of a single piece of gear that I would describe as the best piece of gear, because it's just stuff.
Yeah,
that's my honest answer.
No, that's perfect. Well, look, I sense we could probably keep going all night, but I suggest we draw a line there. Just in terms of housekeeping, Rachel, if we just keep the chat window open until everybody's signed off. And so if anybody wants to put comments or questions or feedback, there's a chat window at the bottom of Zoom. So if you hover over the bottom of your window, click on the chat window. I'm sure Andrew would appreciate feedback.
That would be awesome.